Rochester community. This is Wafal Khalifa, and I work with Destination Medical Center as the Equitable Development Coordinator. I'm here with my colleague, Chow Matala, and she serves the city of Rochester as the Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I welcome you to the October 25th Equity Series episode. And I wanted to share with you that you could past episodes that we have shared with the community in the Destination Medical Center YouTube channel. And if your organization has any questions or concerns, or you're interested in joining the Equity Alliance, feel free to contact Chow or myself, and we'll be more than happy to connect with you to share with you more information about how you can become a member of the Equity Alliance. Now, for today's episode, our episode today, we do have two presenters who are joining us today. We have Nathan Arnosti, the Director of Analytics at the Center for Economic Inclusion, and we have Nashan McKelton, the Director of Sales and Growth at the Center for Economic Inclusion. And for our community members who don't know what is the Center for Economic Inclusion is an organization headquartered in Minnesota that works with public-private sector leaders to close the racial wealth and income gaps and build inclusive regional economies. Both Nation and Nathan will be sharing with you today the topic that we picked for today, which is data-informed tools to drive racial equity and inclusion within organizations, the Racial Equity Dividends Index. And hopefully, with the information that you will hear from both presenters, you'll be able to connect with the Center for Economic Inclusion and to ask more questions about this tool and how you could utilize it in your organization. And before I turn it to our two presenters, I would like to encourage our audience today to utilize the chat function in Zoom today. Please feel free to share your name and the organization that you're associated with. Both Chow and myself will be monitoring the chat closely for all your questions and concerns, and will be able to share them with the presenters. And now I turn it to Nation and Nathan. Welcome to the Rochester community.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, invitation, and also introduction, Wafa and Chow. And hello to all of the participants here today with us. So we are very excited to share with you more about the Center for Economic Inclusion. In some capacity, depending on which organization you are here from, you may be familiar with us to some degree. And hopefully, if you're not, we're able to provide you some clarity on what it is that we do and how we might be helpful to you in a myriad of ways. So more specifically to Wafa's point, we are bringing to this conversation data-informed tools that drive equity and inclusion within organizations. And so one component of the work that we all do, or that we share in some capacity here, is that we're all trying to move the needle towards racial equity. And that can be extremely hard to do if we don't have ways to measure impact, or to even measure disparity, to begin to measure impact, right? And so that is really where an organization like the Center for Economic Inclusion comes in. And so a little bit of an overview for our agenda today. I'll introduce some key facts and highlights about our organization and really ground us all in what it is that we do and how we go to market to do it. And then we will talk about the dividends of racial equity. And my colleague here, Nathan Arnosti, who has been integral in creating and founding this process and implementing it. We're on our third year for the private sector and wrapping up our first year for public sector. So he has a breadth of knowledge that he will share with you all here today. And then we'll talk about action steps. What are some things that we can actually do? You know, a lot of times we have these conversations and sometimes we can walk away feeling like, gosh, there's so much to do. It's insurmountable. Where do I even start? And that can just push it to the back burner as a priority. So we're going to actually leave you all with some key action steps and things that are attainable for you to do as next steps. And we'll also have some Q&A. Awesome sauce. So about the center, Who are we? We are a social enterprise headquartered in St. Paul, which happens to be the capital of this great state, in case any of you didn't know, and one of the best cities across the state. Just throwing that out there. Nonetheless, so we're headquartered downtown St. Paul. If you're ever in the area, the center is home to many organizers, leaders. Please do stop by. Our doors are open. We love to have visits and company and to have these conversations in person as well. What do? We help leaders both in public and private organizations take action to close racial wealth gap, to Wafa's point. That is a big loaded sentence and a big loaded mission, right? And so we'll get to the nuts and bolts a little bit of how we do that. We move people and organizations from this sort of assessment phase and acknowledging disparity to action and accountability so that we can actually build and sustain economies that benefit everyone, not just in a charitable way, but actually seeing different demographics as an asset to the economy. And how do we build an economy that organically and authentically includes them and that we all win and it increases the bottom line for everybody involved. That's who we are. That's what our mission is. Who we are more specifically, we are 32 individuals with great expertise across data and analytics, racial equity practitioners, employer services training consultants, and all the way down to visionary Tawana Black, who has done a host of leadership and speaking engagements, policy enhancements for some of the public leaders here in Ramsey County and Hennepin County. You name it, we've got a little bit of representation across the board here. And so we are all very proud and dedicated to the mission that we serve. And we have most of our team here that actually consults in some capacity as well too. So we're frontline as well as behind the scenes here. And so we're all here to help. Equipping leaders for transformational action. So when we talk about what we do, I like to really highlight the specifics, right? Education, research, racial equity consulting, public policy advocacy, and job creation. And so this mission and these segments that we actually help inform the product of our indices, right? Which Nathan will talk about a little bit more. But it's really to how do we help educate people, right? That's workshops like this one, or cohort workshops, or our immersive learning experiences, which I'll share an example of that in a bit here as well. Research and development. Gosh, there's a lot that goes into building inclusive economies in cities, in towns, and just communities, right? And if the lift is on you and your organization to have all of the research and data points, historical data points that help you craft a meaningful plan, it's not really possible. It's not, right? And so the center really is sitting and housing that data and that research and lifting it in the proper way to help you action things in a way that you can actually start to move the needle on a diverse community for yourself and a diverse economy where you are. Racial equity consulting. Okay, so we give you the information, we give you some education. Now what? We need support. A lot of times, DEI teams or even city teams, leadership teams, they can be small and mighty, and the center has recognized that. And we have really strengthened our racial equity consulting arm to be able to actually support people after we deliver this information. And so when we're able to help you orient yourself around the research, what the data shows, educate you on what it means, what racial equity truly is, how the systems have informed where we all are today, then we come in and say, okay, great. We can actually supplement your team for a little bit and handhold you to implement some of these strategies or to craft the strategy design forward so that you are supported adequately, even where you may not be able to actually create new roles dedicated to this. We can be there as a temporary handhold to help you implement and actually start taking some of these actions. Public policy advocacy. We have a dedicated resource here at the center who is, I think, actually running for an office seat too, but who is always advocating for the policies that help organizations that we serve move the needle forward. And we've experienced quite a few wins in that regard. And so we're trying to really support the mission and the efforts of this work from all angles, making sure that there's representation at that policy level and at that legislative level where we can actually not have you get sideswiped by some of the changes that you're trying to make and have systems that can support you in that. And then lastly, job creation. We have seen it all at the center, right? From private sector to public sector, the challenges amongst talent acquisition and then talent retention, or knowing that the diverse talent is sitting within your area, but they're not engaging within the community, or knowing that they're not there and you can't get them to commit to your community, right? They're visiting, they're coming to town, but we can't entice them to stay or whatever the case is. We've got a couple of well-known tactics and strategies that have actually worked across different public sector and private sector accounts that we've supported. And we can help you out with some of that too. And so rolls up a little bit into our racial equity consulting at times, but it's something that we have a dedicated support to. On this slide, you also see, which we can leave this deck to be distributed afterwards as well, but you'll see exactly how this breaks out in some of our actual product services and offerings too. So. And earlier I talked a little bit about the education component. And so there's a couple ways that we do that. We have covenings, we have summits where we bring some of the best and brightest leaders, both from private sector and public sector, into spaces to have the tough discussions, to share their strategy before it's going live, to share their progress, and also some of their shortfalls, right? So that bringing these leaders together in a safe space to actually learn and grow together and ideate together has proven to be extremely powerful over the last 3 years or so. We also do our tours, our racial reckoning for truth and racial justice tours. We actually just had a cohort come back from that. And as always, the feedback is always just life-changing. And it's been integral in the exposure that some people just lack in understanding how long-standing many of these policies and systemic structures are and where this is stemming from and the root cause of a lot of the things that we are working to fix now and to solve for. So that tour is an immersive experience. We try to stray away from sort of the conference room where someone is just speaking at you, giving you speeches, right? And so we said, hey, let's get people down to Atlanta to some of the biggest civil rights and historical monuments. We kick it off there. We get on a bus. We head over to Selma and Montgomery in Alabama. And there's breakout sessions to digest what we're experiencing and learning with our racial equity consultants and experts as well. We're also very cognizant to have C-suite leaders grouped together, mid-level management teams grouped together, and frontline employees grouped together if they're present as well. But we understand that the context of those conversations can be impactful, and we want to create the space for leaders to actually learn in a way that is not going to negatively impact their team, direct report strategy, or the work that we do day in and day out. So it's something to consider. Again, I'll share this out with you all. We do have another tour coming up here at the end of January, which I will be on that tour. And yeah, it's just a life-changing immersive learning experience. So, and again, some other products and services that we offer, right? And so we're going to be talking about the Racial Equity Dividends Index. And we've got a quote here from the VP of Social and Environmental Impact at 3M on how integral the index has been to their organization and the progress that they've been able to make over the past 3 years. I think this is their 3rd year participating, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, tons of specific ways that the center can reach out and be of support to you. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Nathan here, and we will continue to educate you all on the index.
Thank you so much, Nation, and thanks for that good overview. The center is kind of a tough organization to describe because we do so many different types of things and have so many different areas of work. So it's great to see you all. My name is Nathan Arnosti. I'm the director of analytics at the center. And as Nashan mentioned, I've been here for a few years. And one of the core projects that I've been leading over these past couple of years are the Racial Equity Dividends Indices. We have two of them now, one for the private sector and one for the public sector. And so excited to share specifically what those tools are, how we think about racial equity and advancing racial equity within organizations and so on. One really quick note before we move on, just to plus one what Nashan said about the tours. I went on a tour last March with the center, and it was really, incredibly powerful experience. And so, and you just had such rich conversations among the 50 or so leaders who were there. And so absolutely recommend that as well. But one thing before we get into the index is to kind of talk about the way that we think about racial equity and inclusion, right? Because the center takes a different approach than what you might see, right? We recognize that racial equity is both a moral and an economic imperative, right? We recognize that there's a long history and long legacy of inequitable policies and practices, right, that have gotten us to the inequities that we see by race today. And at the same time, we've looked through a lot of the data and the research to see there are real tangible benefits that you get. So we urge organizations to be thinking about racial equity in those terms as well, to be thinking about this in terms of how can our organization benefit by becoming more inclusive, by investing in these strategies and tactics. So we can go to the next slide, Nashan. So just a couple points of research that we wanted to lift up. One is that inclusive hiring pays dividends, right? There's a Harvard Business School research study that found a 1-to-1 ROI to profitability for companies that were strategically focusing on increasing their racial and gender diversity, right? Especially in more homogenous, more male-dominated fields, right? There's many reasons for why this happens. Oftentimes, diverse teams take more serious looks at data, have different perspectives. There's productive conversations. People have new ideas. You're reaching new markets. So there's all sorts of reasons that are factoring into why gender and racial diversity are really valuable to organizations. The contrary is also true, right? There's this study from Klein and others a couple of years ago that showed that companies that had racially discriminatory hiring practices was actually negatively correlated with their firm profitability, right? So this is just kind of the two sides of this coin that really this is a very positive thing to invest in for your bottom line. The second slide and thing that we wanted to emphasize, you might have seen some McKinsey and company studies. There are a number of these studies. I feel like they release another one every couple of years, showing that exact same trend, right? That the more racially diverse teams within organizations, those companies tend to outperform those that are more homogenous. And here's another quote from a different study showing that racial diversity is associated with greater sales revenue, more customers, greater market share, and greater relative profits. So just wanted to share those pieces of research to ground everyone in understanding this as an opportunity, right? This is an opportunity for all of us to, organizations to continue to grow, right? To continue to develop, do right by its people for many ways, and also benefit while doing that. So that gets us to what the Racial Equity Dividends Indices are, right? In short, these are tools to help companies and local governments improve their performance, competitiveness, and growth by implementing racially equitable practices. Let's talk about what that means. So first off, as Nashan was mentioning, I joined in June of 2021 at the center, and we launched exactly a year after I joined, we launched the first Racial Equity Dividends Index. So that was the 2022 report. We've since released a 2023 report also last June. You can go to our webpage and take a look at this. So across those years, since 2022, we've had 51 businesses in Minnesota that have participated in this index, which has been, really wonderful. We've been thrilled to have these numbers of companies, signing up and wanting to take the plunge with us. These businesses are really spanning many different sectors, right? Healthcare organizations, construction, finance, and more. And collectively, they have quite a powerful economic punch, right? So there's more than 200,000 Minnesotans that are employed at these organizations, full-time, part-time, and contingent workers, more than 900,000 employees globally. one of the features and things that we talk about just related to the employee counts is there are Fortune 500s that are participating in this index. There are also much smaller companies that also see the value of these types of assessments and tools, right? So we have companies that are, less than 100 employees, full-time employees that are participating. Many companies that are in the kind of several hundred to several thousand range, and then there's some, some bigger fish even than that. So it is a tool for all company sizes. Thanks, Nation. So what is the Racial Equity Dividends Index, right? What is the way we approach this work? There are 43, based on our research, 43 racially equitable standards that we identify in this index across 7 dimensions of organizational activity, right? So leadership, culture, retention, advancement, hiring, your procurement, public policy efforts, philanthropy and investment, your products and services. Across each of these areas, we've identified a number of strategies, practices, and policies and practices that research shows organizations benefit from and can be successful in increasing the racial diversity, racial equity, right, racial inclusion within their organization. So a couple sample questions of what these are. Does your organization pay all employees a family sustaining wage? And we define a family sustaining wage using the MIT Living Wage Calculator definition, right? They create geographically specific areas based on cost of living and whatnot. So they're defining a specific wage threshold. In this case, we used the family sustaining wage rate across Minnesota. So this is, including Rochester, includes the Twin Cities, includes other parts of the state. And that ends up being around $25 an hour. It's about $52,000 a year for a full-time worker. So that's one question. Another question we ask is, does your organization have a minority business enterprise procurement strategy with measurable goals, right? We show that, when you have procurement, it's one thing to have a really good procurement strategy and thoughts about how do you build supplier diversity. It really helps to have specific goals that you're aiming towards, right? And to have accountability across your organization to say, this is not just a want to have kind of situation. We want to invest, is it 10%, 15%, 20% of our contracts with businesses that are owned by Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Asian led and owned suppliers. So within each of these, and sorry, just one more point on this one, within these questions, we have kind of multiple choice responses. So that allows us to kind of gather, compile data, create statistics around what share of companies are implementing these types of standards. Thanks, Nation. So the other component of what we measure as part of this tool is workforce and supplier diversity data, right? So the standards relate to policies and practices. Do you have the infrastructure in place to build a racially equitable organization? This gets to some of the outcomes, right? Racial equity outcomes you could think about. So related to people, right? We look at the workforce diversity of organizations at different levels of their organization. We look at the share of workers by race earning family sustaining wages. We look at hiring, promotion, and retention rates. And then within procurement, we'll look at, what is your total supplier diversity, right? In terms of what is the share of suppliers that are Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Asian owned? And what is your total spend, right? So these are some kind of baseline numbers. This is, to get a little wonky here, organizations are not scored based on these, right? We do offer scores for others so they have a sense of their standing. These data are really intended just for pure comparison, right? We recognize that, if you're based, say, in Rochester, there's a different racial demographics of the surrounding community, right? So, wouldn't necessarily be an apples to apples comparison to say, let's compare the business spend in different regions of the country. So we're sharing this data really for your informational purpose, so you can understand how you compare to other participating organizations. Go to the next slide. So, some people have asked, why do companies want to participate in this, right? It sounds like you're collecting a lot of data. It sounds like it's a lot of work for us to put this together. By the way, it's not that much work. We've really tried to streamline this and make this, accessible for you all. But one of the core pieces of value add that we see for companies is these score reports, right? Every company that participates gets a customized score report that shares their overall score, and scores are normalized out of 100 total points, shows you your percentile across peers. It gives you, an in-depth peer comparison. So we'll create peer groups that are appropriate for your company. Say you're a company of 150 people. We're not going to be comparing you to 3M, right? You're in a different space in terms of what you have the bandwidth and resources and capacity for. But we will be comparing you to, say, other organizations with 500 or fewer full-time employees, right? That might be a more appropriate benchmark. So you can see here, within the score report, and there's, it ends up being close to 20 pages, I think, of these reports. We'll show you, here's what your answer was, here's where your organization is, and here's how you compare to the peer group, right, on each specific question. We also include customized recommendations to point some directions of where you can take further action, add a case study of a different organization that's succeeding and doing this well, and other data insights that will be useful to you in mapping out how you want to approach racial equity and your strategies to drive racial equity in the upcoming year. So another question we sometimes will get is, there's so much interest, especially in Minnesota, right, related to racial equity, DEI, right, JEDI, there's all sorts of acronyms that are floating around out there. How does the Racial Equity Dividends Index differ, right? And then I would say this differs in a couple of ways. The indices identify specific racial equity standards and tangible actions that can be taken across an organization, right? So we're talking about, specific strategies as you'd seen, right? Paying family sustaining wages, developing plans for procurement, right? Other tangible things that you can do, right? Another one, and this is based on the feedback that we were conducting really, since George Floyd's murder, in May 2020, right? And talking to a lot of business leaders, there's a lot of energy, a lot of action. And they were saying, we can barely figure out what we're doing as organizations. We have no idea how we compare to peers, right? So having that quantifiable scoring, having a confidential peer comparison, those are some of the elements that we really think set this tool apart. And lastly, it defines, what to do rather than how to do it, right? So there might be other toolkits or other, processes that will say, follow this checklist. Make sure you've got the right voices in the room and are being inclusive. Start with this process or this procedure, right? In building a consensus, have this worksheet that folks can fill out. That's all really important work, right? And so it's really complementary. Those are complementary tools to what we're doing. But we're defining specifically, what is the standard? What is the practice that we think organizations can do? We can move to the next slide. So I've been describing kind of the index framework and structure and design to date. I did want to get a little bit into the data because there's some really great insights. You can go deeper, much deeper on our website, take a look at our report, and I'm sure we can drop a link to that report in the chat. But here's an example of some of the data that we see from this, right? So this is looking at procurement strategies, right? So you can see the yes responses are in purple, right? If you've somewhat made some progress in implementing the standard, it's in blue. Oh. If you've made, you haven't yet implemented the standard, it'd be in yellow, right? And so you can see, for example, that half of the companies that participated in the index last year have a minority business enterprise procurement strategy with measurable goals, right? By comparison, you can see a slightly smaller share that are taking a strategy like, are you requiring that all RFP and bid processes have at least track the number of bids and have at least one bid from a Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Hispanic owned supplier, right? So you can see here, this is really powerful insight to recognize there are certain strategies that many companies that are participating are already implementing, right? And that's great. It's the product of a lot of really hard work. And then there are other strategies that are kind of earlier stage, right? There's a handful of companies at the vanguard thinking about this and that there's a progression. So ideally what we want to be seeing and sparking with these reports is to help organizations understand where they are currently, what progress they can make, and see these numbers increase, right? So that we're having more and more implementation of these racial equity standards over time. To the point about workforce demographic data, right? One of the really powerful insights we can have is we have this combined data then across all companies that participate. What are the racial demographics that we're seeing? Right? And so for comparison, we offer the state of Minnesota's racial demographics and the Twin Cities metro areas demographics. You can see the state of Minnesota, about 20% people of color, right? About 80% white, right? Minneapolis, St. Paul is about 25%, 75%, right? And so by comparison, you can see, the companies collectively have a lot of racial diversity that have participated, right? There's a lot of, they've had some real successes. But I wanted to point out this piece on executive leadership, and this is a trend that we see with clients, that we see with individual organizations. This is a broader pattern that typically the executive leadership cohort, right, of folks across these organizations tend to be more homogenous, tend to be more white, right? And so that's a real opportunity that many organizations are facing, is thinking about how do we build inclusive and racially equitable or racially diverse leadership teams, right? And how do you build a culture that retains those leaders, right? It's not just about hiring, it's also about building that culture of inclusion and retention, right? We can go to the next slide. So we have done plenty of talking, but hope this has been a useful, initial overview and glimpse at what the Racial Equity Dividends Index is. We've got a handful of slides at the end, but we wanted to pause here and just give you all a chance to come off mute, add some ideas to the chat, come on screen. We'd love to see your faces if you aren't too ashamed about eating or anything like that. No judgment there. And just give you a chance to explore some racial equity standards that we have in our index, right? So here we have identified 4 standards you can see on the left, right, relating to 4 different categories of the index. So one leadership standard we have is, does your organization's senior leadership reflect the current racial demographics of your region, right? One hiring standard is, does your organization require hiring managers to consider racially diverse slates of candidates during the application and the interview stages, right? A culture retention and advancement standard is, does your organization pay all employees a family sustaining wage for Minnesota? And a procurement standard, as you've seen, does your organization have an MBE procurement strategy with measurable goals? So the moment I wanted to hear from you all here is just have a little bit of discussion. Which of these standards catches your attention, and what benefits could these standards offer to your organizations, and what would it take to implement these standards? So feel free to take any of those questions and come off mute. We'd love to hear from you all. And we have at least 5 or 10 minutes for a conversation.
I think, Nathan, those 4 focus areas is something that in the city of Rochester and DMC we have discussed that we would like to focus on those areas for sure. But how important is to have the leadership component of the racial equity standard?
I think it's critical, right? And Wafai, I know it's a great question. I know you probably see this too and understand this too. When you have a senior leadership team that is homogenous, right? In any race or ethnicity, right? You might miss really valuable perspectives, and you're trying to provide services, you're trying to reach communities and consumers across a very diverse region that we have, right? And very diverse state that we have. You'll miss things, right? You'll miss opportunities. You won't have insights. You won't have new innovations that can come. So, furthermore, who your senior leaders are is a representation of your company, right? Your company's values, the way your company operates, and it can send a signal. I think a really powerful one that we hear frequently is, when you've got a entry-level employee, right, and say they're a person of color, say it's a Hispanic woman, right, you hired right out of college. If she's looking up at leadership ranks and not seeing your racially diverse leadership team up there, she might have questions about how many options do I have, right, for further advancement and promotion, right? So these things all matter for internal demographics and for internal culture. It also really matters for your business prospects and operations. But I think there's many answers to this. So that's just one.
And as my colleague Chow put in the chat, that your comments, questions um, are welcome here in the chat. So feel free to utilize that. Or if you would like to unmute yourself and share your thoughts or opinion
Yes.
about these discussion items that's listed there. So, but looking at the four areas and how you have this time right now for discussion, Nathan. Um, does an organization need to work on the four areas right from the beginning, or is that something that they begin with one and then, I mean, like, how can we prioritize between all these sections, knowing that I'm looking from the audience that we have here, we have a lot of audience members from Rochester Public Schools. We have from audience from the county, Olmsted County. We have members from leaders from nonprofit organizations as well. So how can we prioritize? Do we need to begin with leadership first, with hiring, or how can we do it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate you giving people some time to finish their bite of the sandwich, because we do want to hear from other folks too. But no, I think so. There's 7 categories across the index. There's 43 standards, right? So that means there's at least 43 ways to approach this, right? We don't have a specific playbook that we think every organization needs to follow, because we think it's really important to customize and to meet, what are your strengths? Where do you currently have resources? Where do you have capabilities and capacity, right? So these are strategic decisions that we ask the kind of each organization that participates to think about, right? Maybe it's going to be, the focus based on what they've been hearing internally is, we really want to work on getting that baseline pay level up, right? Or maybe we really want to focus on new hiring processes, because we know we're missing some folks in our hiring process as it is. So I think this is up to organizations to decide. One other point that you'd raise, which I think is a really good one, is that there's nonprofits and folks from school districts here, and that's all wonderful too. The index is specifically designed for companies, but we've actually had a number of nonprofits that have come up to us and said, we want this tool, we want to use this, right? Can we have access? Would it be possible for us to take it and get a score report? And while this is geared towards the private sector as a way to kind of move private sector action, you'll see that a lot of these are really about being a good employer, right? Regardless of whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a for-profit, whether you're in the schools. And so we will, allow organizations that are nonprofits or outside of this kind of private sector label to take this index. There have been, I think, at least 10 or so that have already taken that and received score reports. Their data isn't included in our overall report, but they still get all of the same deliverables that we offer others.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Nathan and Lafa, to your question about where do we start? How do we prioritize any of these categories? That I personally really work closely from that handoff from when we get the reporting and data and analytics and these key recommendations. That report that the index gives at the end of it comes with a top 3 immediate recommendations based on what we've implemented elsewhere to achieve success or to make some measurable impact. But then you really work pretty closely with me to define what's within reason. And when I say within reason, what do you have the people bandwidth for? What do you have the budget bandwidth for? And what do we have the time bandwidth for? And that we take a look at those, and I really help you fraction out what's a good first step. And so that is something that is really specific, because the answers to those 3 things are different at different companies at different times. And so we really work to figure out where you can make some measurable impact and help you leverage that report, the index report of outcomes, to actually report up to leadership, sometimes often helping you make the business case and tie it to the metrics that matter to your organization so that you can gain that leadership buy-in. That's really where I've been spending a lot of my time working with clients after the index results are released to them.
Thank you, Nation. It's a great point. So I want to focus attention on this second bullet just to get some ideas, right? what are some benefits that standards like these could offer, right? What are some of the things that we could see, based on these four that you're seeing to the right or to the left? Any brave soul want to come off mute or share something in the chat? I'm very patient waiting. I'm willing to just sit here, and if people need to think, that's okay. But would love to get a little interaction from folks.
Can I say a comment as we're waiting for comments or thoughts from our audience to share in the chat or to speak? Is something that I personally have experienced, and I know a lot of colleagues and leaders have experienced, which is once we meet the commitment, sometimes you feel like you don't know where to begin. And if we're able to find standard, a program, something that gives us a plan, where can we focus our work and efforts is really important.
Yes. Yep. I think that's a great point. And we're seeing, Amanda, thank you for
Yes.
sharing this question too. The transparency is a really, it's an issue that definitely requires some thought, right? The way we approach these reports is that we will not share organizations' disaggregated data in terms of their specific responses with anyone else, right? We keep that confidential because we think it's really important that organizations have the power to share this as they see fit, right? What we will share is an overall report, right? Talking about overall trends that we're seeing, right? And this is in part because we really want to be offering more of a carrot with this tool than a stick, right? We recognize that this requires partnership. It already requires some risk taking from companies' perspectives to say, we're going to sign up for this, we're going to participate in this process. So, we certainly don't want to discourage companies from taking that first step of taking this index by saying we're going to publicize your mistakes and blame you. But I do think that you're spot on. That transparency is really important for accountability. We always will recommend that organizations share this broadly within their teams, use this to guide action. And what we've found in conversations with a lot of organizations have taken is that they do take that step, right? But they oftentimes want to be the ones to think through the messaging and to say, these are our results, and here's what we want to do about this, right? So it's a really good question, though. Did you have any others that you wanted to raise? Okay, yep, I really appreciate that question. Okay, well, let's keep moving. It seems like we got a group that's a little shyer, but that's okay. We'll have more time for questions at the end. So just to name a couple tangible benefits that we have. Financial institutions, Andrew, yes, I should mention that financial institutions, interestingly, are one of the most, the highest share of sectors. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off. I think for our viewers who will watch the video later in YouTube, I think they'll benefit from hearing the full question.
Of course.
So let's read the full question so then it can be on the recording.
Yes. So Andrew is asking, have you seen financial institutions incorporate the index? And it's a great question. Yes, we have seen a number of banks, credit unions, organizations that have taken this. One other point kind of related to what Amanda was raising on accountability is we do celebrate the high scoring organizations, right? And this is another feature of what we can offer. If you've put in work and you've built some strategies and you're doing well, right? We want to celebrate and recognize, hey, here's an organization that is at the forefront, who's really thinking about this, whether it's hiring or procurement or products and services. So you can see our past report, and that will give you a sense of some of the higher scoring organizations. It's not all organizations, and so you can see within that, those are public names. US Bank, for example, is one of those organizations that has participated, but there have been a number of others too. But great question. So what we wanted to just talk about is kind of link these back. So these are standards that are all related to the tangible benefits, right, that you might get. So, related to senior leadership, demographics, and WFA, this was your question. And the hiring, managers, we find, more innovation, more careful analysis, greater market share for organizations that invest. For organizations that are paying employees, family sustaining wages, we see improved employee retention, right? Reduced costs from hiring and higher quality services. And related to procurement, right, you can see more resilient and agile supply chains, right, from that work. So we can go to the next slide. Yes. Oh, Carrie, you have such a perfectly timed question. I'm going to read this to Wafa's point, because we are just about to talk about the public sector version of this. So thank you for showing that the index is particularly related to private organizations. As someone working in a government organization, do you see extra challenges or a different path in moving into the how after you get results? Terry, you probably know your organization. You do know your organization much better than I do, but I could say broadly speaking, absolutely yes, right? We know public sector organizations and private sector organizations have different incentives, have different responsibilities, have different roles, right? They have different structures, different accountabilities. So that exact point, right, of that this lands differently and plays out differently in a public space is why we wanted to create a separate tool that was modeled off of this private sector index, but specifically adapted for the public sector. So that's what gets us to this racial equity dividends index for the public sector. Here we've identified 70 racial equity standards across 11 different dimensions. So you can see that second row below, these are local government specific responsibilities: community and economic development, workforce development, public safety, housing, transportation, land use, and human services. Within those, we've conducted research and found different standards that we think really support racial equity, right, and racially equitable outcomes. So this is a tool that's geared for cities and counties, right, across Minnesota currently. We'll be looking into getting this available to local governments outside of the state as well. Sample questions here, does your organization follow a regular process at the onset of major initiatives to determine how to engage Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Asian communities, right? Knowing that community engagement is one of those fraught topics, right, where it really matters to get community perspectives, and research has shown historically that the folks who tend to have the biggest sway and the biggest voices in local government decisions tend to be wealthier, tend to be whiter, right, tend to be homeowners rather than renters, tend to be older, right? So it's not necessarily a representative group. So that's just one example of a standard that we think really can take a different approach here. We can go to the next slide. As mentioned, so in putting together this index, we've shared and kind of gathered different research from a range of different organizations that are thinking about this, right? Brookings Metro, PolicyLink, the Urban Institute, Race Forward, NACO, NLC. These are all organizations that are thinking about racial equity across local governments, what can be done. I'm a little partial to Brookings Metro, I'll admit, because I worked there for 4 years. But these are really great organizations that are doing some good research, and so we've added those insights into this tool. Thank you, Chao, for sharing that. Yes, we do have some really great participation from the index for the public sector. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Nashan.
Let me make sure I unmute. So awesome. We've actually had a member of our team drop in the chat. Sorry, that's why I was a little distracted trying to get the link for you all to some of the ways that we celebrate and promote the outcomes of people that have been, not people, organizations and the people in them that have been committed to moving the needle year over year. And so there's a link in the chat to the Twin Cities Business Journal article that's highlighting 3M, US Bank, a couple other organizations that are seeing it through post George Floyd and are seeing some measurable impacts in their organizations as a result of the index and some of the other choices and strategies that they've implemented thereafter. So take a look in the chat at that. It could be helpful to some of the questions earlier. Regarding FAQs, I think we have covered some of these through Nathan's facilitated convo, which is awesome. We'll leave you guys with this too, but companies and city governments are eligible to register, and even nonprofits, to Nathan's point. So basically, if you're interested, reach out to me. I will leave you all with my information here in the chat as well. And I can explain to you the parameters in which it can be helpful to you. And so while it may not be included in the public report that we put out annually, there still can be a great deal of benefit actually to your nonprofit organization or to other organizations of having those metrics as well. So there's that. And then the index survey is completed once per organization on an annual basis. So this is not like a quarterly thing. This is something that we do once annually, and we keep the needle moving. Sometimes it's biannually for organizations if they've got a lot of work to do, or maybe there was some strategy implementation. But for the most part, we're able to see people show up and sign up year over year when they're really committed to moving that needle and looking at a baseline of measurements and measuring the success and some of the strategies they're implementing. The pricing includes a briefing with our CEI staff to understand potential next steps. So all of those beautiful people at the center that I showed you on slide number 2, a handful of them will be there with you to go over and debrief you on what exactly your scores mean in each of these indicators areas. And that's where I come in, to Wafa's point earlier, to help you decide, okay, what makes most sense for you to tackle first, and what can you realistically tackle first. And we've got a great deal of experience in helping people decide that across different size, scale, and priorities at organizations, frankly. Are there any other lingering questions for us here? Okay, I'll check the chat as well shortly, but let's build together. We love to say that at the center. That is what we're doing, laying bricks with different organizations and in different segments to build stronger economies. And so a couple of action steps to my point at the beginning that we can take: you can register for the private sector or public sector index. That's something I can assist you with directly. It's also available on our website if you just go to the index there. Participate in an anti-racist education opportunity. So our tours that I talked about, those are have become known as very safe spaces to have tough conversations and ask the questions that you may feel like you're not allowed to ask in other areas, and to have those conversations to come back more informed in a safe way. As well as we have Fall Forum series. I think our second one is coming up here toward the end of November. So I can share that with you. There's a virtual option there. And so tons of opportunities coming out of the center for being educated and ways for you to participate. What's sort of a nuanced part of this piece is that you also get to be a part of a community. And so you all are here today because you're interested in moving this needle forward and doing this work. And there are tons of people across the state who are also interested in doing some of the same things that you are actively working on as well. And the center has become really good at putting all those people in the same rooms. And so Wafa has definitely attended our summits before, and other leaders. And it's just a really good time to remember that this state is one team, this state is one state, and that there are other cities and communities that are solving for the same things that you all are solving for, that have been able to move the needle. And being in the same space with those people can really help us get out of our silos and actually create more momentum. So participate is number 2. Build a roadmap for equity inclusion with our consulting team. Get in touch with us. We, if you feel like you have some metrics already, we can assess those. There's all sorts of things that we can put into play and to meet with our actual consultant team to figure out what makes the most sense for your team. And then join a tour, which I've hit home as my favorite educational option for the center. But please reach out to us if you have any questions about any of these. Here's some of the ways that we can be interacted with, or that you can follow what's going on with us at the center. And then, of course, like I said, we will share this presentation and I will drop some contact information here in the chat. And thank you so much, Wafa and Chow, for having us here.
Thank you, Nation, and thank you, Nathan, so much for your presentation today. I did receive a private comment from one of our audience, and mainly the focus of the comment is and I thought that I should kind of bring it up because maybe it could be a thought that someone else has this similar thought. Sometimes organizations, when they commit to making action and making changes, they expect that the results happen immediately, right? So I feel just from understanding the message that I received from one of the participants here is that organizations sometimes feel, oh, we have done what we should be doing in terms of diversifying our leadership, doing what we should be doing, but still we're losing the demographics in the community. What do you both, Nathan and Nation, think in terms of organizations following the steps that you shared and the focus areas? Does that translate to immediate results? And what would be a realistic expectation or results out of going through an assessment and a process like this?
Yes, I can start quickly because I think
You
you'll
go
have
ahead. Yeah.
more to say than I do, Nathan. But one thing that I want to highlight there is that yes and no. There's not a straight answer for that, right? Because on the one hand, oftentimes what I'm seeing is that the index and the outcomes is the first benchmark at many organizations. And so in that regard, that is a huge progress to most executive level leaders or C-suite leaders out of their DEI team and department. It's like, oh, wow, you're actually able to quantify this and give me some benchmarks and tell me where we're landing compared to others. So I say yes for that reason, because I've seen that gain buy-in and move the needle significantly pretty quickly at the end of those results, right? It serves as sort of this initial assessment that I think a lot of upper leaders are looking for to be able to allocate budget, time, capacity to these initiatives. And so I'll say that. The other thing that I'll say is year over year, when we look at what we're celebrating with 3M or US Bank, we're not necessarily looking at huge swings, right? But we are looking at consistency as a win. Like, hey, we didn't lose, we were able to retain talent versus every other year prior, we lost a big chunk of the diverse talent that we were able to bring in. And so we are actually able to leverage just that annual benchmark to demonstrate where there is actually progress that we haven't been able to, or organizations haven't been able to actually quantify and explicitly state before. And so I'll say that, and I'll hand it over to the expert, Nathan, here.
No, you got it, Nation. I mean, yeah, I suspect that everyone in this room has an answer to this as well and has some really good ideas about this too. Um, the um, the takeaway I have is that this is a journey, right? And this is not a destination, right? Um, even the highest scoring companies score about 60 out of 100 points on this index, right? Which shows that they've made some progress, but they've got a long way to go too, right? And so we don't expect that companies, can implement all of these overnight. They take thought and time and resources and accountabilities and staff capacity and all sorts of things, or at least some of them. Some of them are a little bit easier to implement and are just policy changes that you can change. But it's a journey, and it's just in striving for an equitable organization is how we get closer to it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering that comment. I believe I shared it with you, Nathan, privately, but I would like to thank you both again for joining us today on the October Equity Series episode. I think the information is very valuable. And one of the comments that Chow Matala shared earlier, that Olmsted County and City of Rochester are participating in the public-private um, um, index, and we hope that we can get more and more organizations in our community to join and to utilize this tool in order to understand our organizations internally, and how can we become more transparent internally in order to make tangible changes in our community. Thank you again both, and thank you to all our audience who joined us today, and we hope that we get to see you next month, November 22nd. I know it's a couple of days before or a day before Thanksgiving, but we look forward to seeing you on November 22nd for our Equity Series episode. Until then, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.